A policeman was gravely injured while chasing down a car full of perpetrators. Eventually, he had a severe seizure, and the doctor was about to declare him dead. But then the dog noticed something odd and stopped him. What happened next is a display of loyalty unlike anything you've ever seen. Sergeant Corey Masterson leaned hard on the steering wheel of the Crown Vic. His blues were on, and the siren was blaring. He'd been on the tail of these perpetrators for almost 15 minutes. They had dodged him in the center of town, but now that they had made their way to the interstate where there was less chance of hurting innocent bystanders, the playing field was level. He eyed the SUV ahead of him and then glanced briefly in the rearview mirror at Reno on the back seat. The Belgian Malinois was sitting straight up, his ears perked, and his intelligent eyes following the chase. Suddenly, the perpetrator's SUV veered hard left. It shot ahead and then stopped on the shoulder of the road. All four doors opened. The criminals piled from the vehicle like rats abandoning a ship and scuttled into the woods lining the interstate. Corey looked Reno dead in the eyes and said, "You stay here for now, boy." Then he jumped from the police cruiser, drew his weapon, and headed for the spot where the perpetrators had entered the woods. They were somewhere in the trees, but Corey could neither hear nor see any sign of them. Cautiously, he edged deeper into the woods. He crabbed sideways to cover every angle, his firearm raised and all his senses on high alert. When the blow came, his world suddenly turned into a slow-motion event. As he fell to the ground, Corey knew he'd been ambushed. He understood that he'd been hit on the back of the head with something heavy and that he was in the process of losing consciousness. The last thing Corey did before everything went black was activate the button that would open the car door and release Reno from the car. When the door opened, Reno shot into action like a streak of lightning. His nose told him exactly where to go. In the distance between the trees, he saw Corey motionless on the ground with a large man sitting on his stomach. The man had a huge knife in his hands, preparing to stab Corey. Reno doubled his pace and flew into the air. He tackled the criminal with his full body weight and momentum, sending the man flying. The criminal scrambled to his feet and swore under his breath, saying something about killing both Corey and Reno. Then he charged. In his one hand, he held the 2x4 he'd scooped up. In the other was the knife. Reno met him halfway, the dog tucked under a wild swing of the 2x4. Sid stamped an even wilder slash of the knife and then grabbed the guy's arm a few inches below the elbow. The criminal bellowed like a wounded bull and tried to shake Reno off, but the dog shook back, using his powerful neck muscles to tighten his grip. Eventually, the criminal went down on one knee. He dropped the 2x4 and started stabbing at Reno with the knife, but the dog kept ducking out of the way. In the process, he had to let go of the perpetrator's arm. The man used the opportunity to scramble upright and then ran into the woods. Reno swiveled around and ran straight over to Corey. He sensed his friend wasn't in a good state, and he was the priority. Behind him, Reno heard voices. With his nose still picking up all the scents around him, he ran in the direction of the sounds. It was a second police vehicle that had been following the car chase on the radio and had come in to assist. The two officers recognized Reno from the precinct and followed him to Corey. He was unconscious when they found him and in a worrying state. Once they got to the hospital, things weren't looking good. Doctors ordered a battery of tests and immediately started working on Corey. Reno went home with one of the other officers, but he was up all night. He paced and whined, and then paced some more. When morning came, he was already waiting by the car when Corey's colleague came out of the house. Reno had only one thing on his mind. He had to get to Corey as quickly as possible. There was no telling if his friend needed him at the hospital. The doctor shared the troubling news. Corey had suffered a severe skull fracture from the blow to the back of his head, and there was bleeding in his brain too. He was in a coma, and only time would tell if he would ever get better. They hadn't allowed Reno into the ICU, and he was left lying by the front door of the emergency room. When Corey's fellow officer came out again, Reno looked around anxiously for Corey, but he was nowhere to be seen. He tilted his head and looked at Corey's colleague as if to say, "Where's Corey?" The officer shook his head and opened the door of the patrol car for Reno to slip into the back seat. Reno followed with his tail down. It was as if he could sense what was going on. 3 months later, the decision was made to send Corey home. He was still in a coma, but everybody hoped being in familiar surroundings would help wake him up. Arrangements had been made for around-the-clock care, and the whole precinct was there to escort the ambulance to Corey and Reno's home. Reno found a spot next to Corey's bed and stayed with him day in and day out. It was on a Thursday morning around 5 o'clock that Reno first noticed something was different. The dog wasn't sure exactly what it was, but something was going on with Corey. He flew out of the room and scratched at the door where Corey's caregiver slept. She woke up from the commotion and shuffled after Reno to Corey's bedroom. The sight that greeted them brought tears to her eyes. Corey's eyes were open, and they were focused. He looked at Reno first. "Hello, boy," he said. His arm was weak, almost limp, but he held down an arm to stroke the dog's head. For the next few months, Corey's recovery was slow and arduous. He was struggling to walk. Months of lying on his back had caused his muscles to atrophy, and it would take many months of physiotherapy before he would be up and about again. Then the unthinkable happened one night. Corey tried to get out of bed to go to the bathroom. Reno was immediately awake and ready to follow him, but the sensitive dog noticed something strange was happening. It wasn't necessarily a smell, and it certainly wasn't a sound. It was more like something in the air that set his senses on high alert. Reno tilted his head and looked carefully at Corey. His friend was on his feet now, but still very unstable. The next moment, Corey's face contorted into a pained expression. He clenched his jaw, and his eyes seemed to bulge out of his face. Reno streaked down the passage to the caregiver's bedroom. He scratched, barked, and snarled until he could hear movement inside the room, and then ran back down the hall to Corey's bedroom. By now, Corey had fallen. His body was still convulsing, and a thin layer of foam covered the corners of his mouth. The caregiver came into the room and took over. She spoke softly to Corey, placing a pillow under his head to support his neck, and gently rolled him onto his side. She checked his pulse and listened for breathing. Then she phoned the doctor. When the physician arrived, he examined Corey and then shook his head. He turned and spoke urgently to the caregiver. There was a general sadness in the room. They were talking and acting as if Corey was dead. Reno had seen this many times during his service. People acted like this when people had died. But Reno couldn't understand it, not at all. The doctor seemed to think Corey was dead, but Reno knew he was not. When they brought a stretcher up to remove Corey's limp figure, Reno went into full combat mode. He stood over Corey with 2 legs on either side. Then he pulled his lips back to expose his teeth, and he growled menacingly. Every time somebody tried to come closer, the growl turned into a snarl, and when they backed off, it settled into an ominous growl again. This went on for more than an hour. Then a second hour passed. The doctor had phoned the police department. He wanted them to send somebody over to pick up the dogs till they could remove Corey's body. The captain himself arrived on the scene. When he saw Reno standing over Corey's lifeless shape, he looked down at his feet. He told the doctor this was not going to be as easy as it seemed. Corey and Reno had been comrades for 7 years. They had a virtually unbreakable bond. Reno watched all of this play out in front of him. Somehow, he had to get them to understand that they were wrong. Corey wasn't dead, he could feel it. The doctor told the captain that Corey had no heartbeat and wasn't breathing. No amount of CPR would bring him back now. But while he was speaking, Corey started coughing. Reno stood to the side, but still kept a beady eye on the doctor and the captain. The next morning, the doctor was on television telling the nation that he had witnessed a rarity called the Lazarus effect. Corey had seemed dead, but it was just a result of a severe epileptic seizure, which had happened because of his head injury. It might have taken the doctor a cough to understand. The dog had known Corey was alive all along. Corey recovered with his faithful companion by his side. He knew Reno would always have his back.